G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If my drawings are known for anything, it's probably the detail that I include in my architectural scenes. It's the one characteristic of them that I get the most comments about, which always pleases me because drawing the detail is the part I enjoy most about the scenes that I draw. In fact, it's usually why I choose the scenes to draw that I draw. And what I've worked out is that part of the reason for the way the drawings turn out is the technique that I've developed over a number of years to capture the effect of the detail. Because the truth is, regardless of how much detail I actually include in my scenes, there is simply way too much detail to capture with any exactness. In something such as a tree, there are clearly simplifications that have to be made, although using tone does provide some shortcuts. But with architecture stretching back into the distance, photos capture an amount of detail that it's just impossible to copy with any exactness. Particularly when we have scenes that stretch right into the background, there's an incredible amount of detail that actually becomes impossibly too small to draw on any sketchbook scale paper. And particularly if the architecture that we're attracted to drawing is as rich in decoration as the architecture of Paris is, which, as you probably know, is my favourite subject. But one comment that I have also had frequently, which comes from those who I suppose enjoy the drawing so much that they zoom in closely to it, have a closer look to see exactly how have I drawn all this detail? How have I captured really the impossible? And what they say, I think to their surprise, but not mine, is, but when I zoom in and look closely at the detail, it's not there. It just looks like it's there. And as I thought about my technique, I realized that what I'm doing is I'm drawing the effect of the detail. I'm not drawing the actual detail. And while I started doing this with the rich ornamentation of the interior architecture of Paris, I realized in fact that this was the technique I'd been using for a long time, both painting and drawing trees, whether it was the leaves or the branches, because trees present an impossible amount of detail and it can quite easily become overwhelming, which I think is why artists often find trees so difficult to draw, because it's just impossible to draw an exactness of the detail. And this is where I think I began to develop my technique of drawing the effect of the detail, not the exactness of it. So I want to look in some detail with this technique and demonstrate how I use it, how I think when I'm drawing, and how I develop it on the paper. But rather than using architecture or a tree, because I have a number of videos on drawing trees, I have a video playlist on drawing trees if you're interested, because both for drawing trees and for a demonstration of this technique, I think they work quite well. But for this video, we're going to look at another impossibly complex scene, and that's a tangle of field flowers, where we have a mass of blooms, we have a mass of stalks and leaves and buds, and it's the sort of scene that can easily overwhelm if we're drawing with a line. So how do I draw the effect of this detail? Let me demo with drawing this scene now. The drawing takes me 30 minutes to draw, and I use a 0.3mm pen for the whole drawing. At the end, I'm just going to draw some summary points using my drawing of this as the focus. And while I appreciate that many people watching YouTube videos don't make it to the end, can I say this is one video that if you don't want to watch the whole drawing, which will be sped up, and listen to the commentary, at least zip to the end and hear what I have to say to bring all these points together on how I draw the effect of detail rather than the actual detail. But let's go back to our field flowers and start drawing. So apologies, I forgot to turn the camera on when I started drawing, but fortunately I hadn't got very far. But you'll see that what I've started with is drawing some of the closest blooms. And this is a really important principle. What we need to do is make it really easy for people looking at a fairly complex scene to know what's happening, to know what's going on, to know what they're looking at. And so, because this is a scene of flowers, and part of the effect overall is that it's going to be a tangle, because we're trying to represent a tangle of flowers, a full scene of just flowers. We still want it to be easy for people, even though there's going to be so many lines, to still be able to recognize straight away what they're looking at. And the best way to do this is to make sure that we have a few of the object, in this case flowers, really easy to see and really easy to make out what they are. So that means a reasonable size and without a great deal of confusion around them. Now, in this case, there are some parts of the drawing, some parts of the scene, of the reference, where there's darker shadows behind, which actually come up as black, where there's no foliage or leaf directly behind some parts. And so they're in shadow. And where they are behind a flower, then the silhouette of that flower is brought into relief. And that's a great opportunity to use this to really highlight the shape of some individual blooms. And while I get this thought from my reference, this is the sort of detail that I'm quite happy to manipulate in my actual drawing to make sure that I have enough blooms with enough blackness around the edges to really throw them into a nice silhouette, to make really clear at a glance that this is a scene about flowers. Whatever's in this tangle, there are flowers here. The other thing that's important to help establish what we're looking at when it's very complex and it's a mess is, well, not a mess, but it's very complex, a tangle, is the silhouette, is the edges. And that's going to be, in this drawing case, both the silhouettes of actual details of this, which is the flowers, the petals, but it's also in some cases the stems, but also the silhouette of not individual blooms, but of the whole in a way, of the whole scene in a way. And we're going to do that at the end with what we see at the very top, the furthest flowers that we see in this drawing. So that silhouette's going to be very important too, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to give the eyes of the observer some details that stand out really quickly and really easily, that the brain will also then find it really easy to attach meaning to. And in that way, the complexity of the line work, of the detail, won't be overwhelming. That's what I'm trying to do at this point. Now, in practice, the challenge is for me not to get overwhelmed with my tangle. In some ways, drawing the individual blooms is easier than drawing the tangle. But with the individual blooms, it's really important that I focus carefully on a few actual blooms and make an effort to draw them in detail. That I don't just draw a cartoon daisy, that I realize that some of these flowers I'm looking at more face down than side on, and a few I'm even looking at slightly from underneath. It simply depends how their stems are bending. Now, generally, they're all looking about the same because they are tracking the sun, which is in the same place. But within that, there are different tilts and variations of how they're facing the sun. So it's important that I capture the fact that some petals I see almost straight on because they're curving up from behind, and some petals I see almost edge on because they're coming at me from the side, almost edge on. Now you can see what I'm doing here in that I'm establishing the flowers and some stems, and then I'm putting in some buds. These are cosmos. It's actually not in a field, it's in our front yard. I've planted a tangle of them to hide an area where I need to do some landscaping, but haven't had a chance yet. So these are just making a colourful alternative to dirt and weeds. But I'm drawing the flowers and the buds and some stalks, and then I have to put the tangle in between. Now this will be the challenge. Now I am using these darker shadowed areas as a way of providing, if you like, a pathway for the eyes to follow through the tangle. Now, of course, it's not an actual pathway, but it's in a way, it's a visual pathway. It provides some areas of separation so that the whole thing isn't overwhelming. And then it also lets me just get a few more edges, but in less detail. As I go further up, these shadowed areas, I'm not filling them in with as many lines, so that there's a little more white showing through, which has a greyish effect rather than a black effect. And this is part of the creation of a sense of depth, because darker tonal values come forward in a scene and lighter tonal values sit back. So this is also trying to suggest that these parts now are further back than the parts lower down, which are darker, which are blacker. And the same thing with the size, obviously, of the flowers that I draw. But when I'm drawing up here now in the top half of my flowers, I'm trying to draw with a lighter line. I'm still using my 0.3 millimeter pen, but I'm holding it lightly. My lines are lighter. My actual shape work is more gestural, and I'm trying to get a thinner line. Now, I often would switch to a lighter pen at this point, a 0.2 millimeter pen, and then possibly even a 0.1 millimeter pen for the furthest parts. But for this demo, I wanted to show that we can still create effect even if we just have the one pen. That one of the skills we want to develop with our line work is to use a pen with various degrees of heaviness, of strength of pressing on the paper. And not just that, but it's also the speed on the paper. The ink flows while the nib is on the paper. So if the nib is moving quickly across the paper, it's actually in contact with any one bit of paper for less time, and therefore we can get a lighter line and a thinner line as well. So I'm getting kind of basically the overall massive tangle of undergrowth here done, and now I'm working on this silhouette edge up the top, as I told you about. One of the difficult things about doing something such as this, where if you like it's a random spread of forms, is to try and keep it random and to not end up filling every gap equally and losing the spaces in between. It's so easy to do that, and in my experience, if I do this sort of thing and just start thinking of other things while I'm doing it, invariably I'll finish and there'll be no gaps left. I've actually filled them all in with something, or I've put too much tone equally all over the paper. So it is important to be still focused on what's the overall effect. A few times I stood back a little bit, or I stood up at least, and I looked down to just get a sense of where this wandering line of shadow was going, what the overall impact was. Were there any parts that were still too much of a kind of a grey tangle of lines? Because all of these lines that I'm drawing, in effect, it's almost like I'm hatching the entire scene. And so they have a tonal effect. And so I don't want them all to create the same, if you like, mid-grey tonal value. I still want some parts to be lighter, some parts to be really dark, and some parts to be in between. So this is also how we create a sense of distinction. So we're not overwhelmed with the tangle by creating tonal variations in form with our lines. And yet, this is, in effect, even in life, a series of lines. The stalks are lines. The leaves, in this case, are really very needle-like lines. And the petals are the closest thing we get to something that's not a line. And so it's all very jagged. So here we have our tangle of flowers, trying to draw the effect rather than the actual detail. But I just want to outline a few principles of drawing the effective detail rather than the exact detail. And to use an architectural scene, which does offer some possibilities of examples that our flowers don't. When I first look at a complex reference, my first thought as I plan how I'm going to represent some detail, some decoration, is what is the effect? What's the, at a glance, effect of what I see? Not what is the shape, not what is the pattern, but it's an at a glance, what are the things that stand out? And how do they stand out? Why do they stand out? And the answer is often they stand out through shadow rather than through the actual form. In Palais Garnier, where this scene is in Paris, we have these supports for this overhanging balcony, and it's the shadows that the supports cast, which is the primary thing about them. It's the thing we actually notice. That's the way I draw them, primarily is through the shadows. And this is called negative space, where we don't draw things by the, if you like, the outside form, but in effect we draw the space between things. And when we have something such as this, or such as this pattern here, where we have a detailed repetitive pattern, in my experience, the fact that the pattern is repeated is more dominant than the actual pattern. And when we have a pattern such as this, which actually has a fairly extreme perspective impact in it, the shapes of these circles change as they move down one side and down the other, and the shape of these swirling swags is also affected. It's capturing the fact that there is a pattern that's a circular base pattern with some sort of swirly thing connecting each of the rounded patterns is the important thing, and making sure that the pattern that I draw fits the perspective. That's more important than the actual pattern. And the other thing is to draw whatever pattern I draw to represent the more detailed pattern, is to have it in more detail closer than further away if that pattern is in fact repeated. And this pattern here on the underside of this arch is the same pattern that we find here, and the same pattern that we find here, and the same pattern that we find up there. And can I say up here, the pattern, this pattern has been reduced to this. And so it certainly is drawing the effect of the detail, not the actual detail. And yet because the eye has seen this, it carries this, the mind carries this here and here and here. And we see a detail up here that I haven't actually drawn. Another thing that I think is important if we want to capture the effect of detail is where things are symmetrical. Capturing the symmetry is more important, again, than the actual decoration. Capturing the flow of lines of a curving, curling pattern is more important than the actual pattern. And so here, along the back here, we have these rounded medallion type shapes. And there's all sorts of ornate, swirly, scrolly, acanthusy, and even, I think, cherubs on each side. And they're all symmetrical. And the important thing is I capture in some way that what's happening is repeated and it's symmetrical. And so when I'm doing this, I will tend to do all of them across one after the other so that my line work is in the same groove. That the order I do the things and the swirls, the lines, the arm movements I use are the same, because I want them all as much as possible to look the same. And now when we have this section come up here, firstly, the important thing is to keep the perspective correct. So I'm looking straight on here, but this wall is angled away, so it's foreshortened significantly, and it increases in size as it moves closer to us. And these circles become ellipses. But this ellipse is rounder than this ellipse. And the amount of detail I can show here is actually a lot more than I can show there or there or there or there. And so what I need to do is whatever detail I show here, I reduce it as I move further away. Which of course saves a lot of time, but also I'm just actually not going to have the space here to put the detail that I've put here, as reduced as that detail is. Good thing about using tone is that I can use tonal value to emphasize form in a way that is much faster than if I were just using line. Another important technique is to draw the closest detail as carefully as I can for the time I want to draw, and in as much detail as possible. So you'll see that the tops of these columns and the entablature supporting the arch is actually in a fair bit of detail and is in a high, for one of my drawings, a high state of accuracy. Because even though we're actually looking straight through, even though our eyes go firstly to the center and to the brightest, lightest areas, which is here on the far side of the stairway, and this in effect becomes a fancy frame for the view. In life, these are the parts we're still going to see most clearly, in most detail, if we actually look at these rather than in the center. And so we want them to reflect that fact as well. Even so, though, there is simplification here and here with what's actually happening in real life. But being aware of depth of plane is also an important factor when we're simplifying detail and drawing detail to capture the effect rather than the exactness, because the camera captures an alarming amount of detail. But in life, when we look at a complex scene, we're still only seeing a certain part at once. We don't see the whole thing at once. And usually the thing we're looking at is in the most detail because it's usually the closest thing. That's not the case in this drawing, but the principles are the same. The exact way the principle draw the effect of what I see, not the detail, not the exactness of what I see, how that works out in practice does depend on every single scene, on what the subject is, on what the lighting is, on how large I'm drawing it, what the scale is, what size pen I'm using, how much time I have, how gestural overall it's going to be, and so forth. But if I know some of these principles, some of these, if you like, techniques of how I can draw the effect, and I always end up coming back to the tree and the leaves, I can't possibly draw all the leaves. So I need to draw the overall effect of the light on the trees, the in effect surface that's created by all these individual objects. If I know some principles as to how I can do that, then I can seek to apply them to whatever particular example I have in front of me. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If you've made it till now, I hope you feel it was worth it. And I hope you give this principle of drawing the effect of what we see, not an exactness of the detail, a go in a drawing soon. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, why not? And why not hit notifications and know when I post something new? And possibly most helpful of all to me, why not tell some friends who draw about my channel? But look, whatever you do, and whatever you end up drawing, and however you end up drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.